Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us. I'm David Robinson, the LSA's Director of Membership and Meetings. We're going to wait just a few more minutes to allow people to log in, and then we'll get started. Hi, John. Yeah, that's. Yeah, I don't know what's happening, but I think our fallback, if you're okay with it, is I'll just catch you through on my phone and okay.
Open, go to opener. And after a while, it wasn't even giving me a webcam. Now I've got a webcam. Anything?
Yep, John, we can hear you. Hi, everybody. Thanks. We had some technical difficulties with our moderator, but he has joined us. So thank you, John, for joining us. And I think we can go ahead and get started now. So again, hello, everybody, and thank you for joining us. Welcome to Linguistics in the News, How to Own It, the latest in the LSA's series of webinars on professional development topics. I'm David Robinson, the LSA's Director of Membership and Meetings. And as I speak, you'll be seeing a brief presentation about the LSA and what we do, in case you're not already familiar with us. At the last slide, you'll see a code which will give you a 20% discount on a regular or student LSA membership. And before we begin, I'd like to make sure you're familiar with the basics of GoToWebinar operations. First of all, you'll see on your dashboard a handouts widget, and you'll find copies there of each of the panelists' slides, as well as the LSA's guide to working with the news media. And don't worry if for some reason you can't find them. We'll have copies available on the LSA website shortly, and we'll let you know how to find them. Second of all, when the time comes for the question and answer period, you'll be submitting your questions using the questions widget on your GoToWebinar dashboard. Your microphones are silenced by default so that we don't hear miscellaneous background noise, traffic, barking dogs, babies, etc. And finally, you also see an audio widget on your dashboard, which will give you your options for phoning in or using your computer's speakers. Before we get started, I'd also like to run a very brief poll, which will give our panelists a better idea of who you are. I'm going to launch the poll momentarily. Please take just a few seconds to answer it, and once everyone has answered, you'll be able to see the results. So, let's see, I'm about to launch the poll. Okay, here we go. So if you can start answering. And again, once everyone has voted, I'll close the poll and display the results for everyone to see. Okay, we'll wait just a couple more seconds. All right, I'm going to close the poll and then share the results with everybody. So you should be able to see them now. 31% of you are students, 59 are linguists in academia, 8% are linguists in government industry or independently employed, and 3% of you are other. So thanks for that. And I'd like to introduce our moderator, Dr. John McWhorter of Columbia University, whom you will see on your screen, I think. He's going to introduce our panelists. Each of them will speak briefly about their work, and in the last half hour, we'll open the webinar up for question and answer. So John McWhorter, take it away.
Thank you, David, and hello, everybody out there. And I think what we want to discuss today is something that reflects that things have developed in a way that I don't think we linguists are talking about as much as we should, which is that my personal experience, and I've had a few other linguists say this to me, is that these days the public does not think as much as it used to that all being a linguist is knowing a whole lot of languages. Of course, we still get that question as to how many languages we speak, but I think partly because of social media, the general public has more of a sense of what linguistics is now than it used to, or at least they know there's such a thing as linguistics that has nothing to do with being a UN translator or speaking 25 languages. So the question is, how can we take advantage of this, and how can we use the media, social and not, to get our ideas out there? And so if being an academic is partly a matter of educating the world even beyond our classrooms, then how do we do that most effectively? And it gets into certain sub-questions, such as, of the research that we do, I think most of us are aware that usually only a subset of it is going to be of particular interest or enlightenment to the general public. We have to learn how to decide what parts of our research are that. There's something in almost everything that we do that the general public would enjoy and benefit from, but we have to learn how to identify what it is. Or how do you discuss your work in the media effectively in such a way that it comes out best on the other end? Because it's easy to suppose that you just say what you do, and you rather quickly learn that it's nothing of the sort. And so just very briefly, I remember when I first started trying to share linguistics with the media, it was during the Oakland School Board crisis over the use of Black English in the classroom. And I found at the time, having no experience with this, that the media never got past the idea that Black English is just slang. It was very hard as a linguist to put yourself in the head of the people who thought that Black English was only slang, but the media almost never got beyond it. And I was also struck by the fact that the media was struck by things that we think are ordinary. I was talking to Terry Gross at the time. This never made it onto actual NPR, so this is, on the floor. But I did talk to her about Black English, and I discussed habitual be. with her. She was amazed. And we all know that Terry Gross knows everything in the world, and she's spoken to everybody. She had never heard of the habitual use of be and Black English having something systematic in it. She wanted to hear more of that. I hadn't expected it. So what we want to explore in this webinar is how to be more effective at getting what we do across to that media out there who are very interested but are not usually thinking the way we do. And so we have 4 people here who can give many nuggets of wisdom about this from many different perspectives here in 2019. And the first is Michelle McSweeney. And Michelle McSweeney has her PhD in linguistics from CUNY here in New York, and she studied, among a great many other things, text messaging and natural language processing. Michelle is one of the winners of the 5-Minute Linguist contest. She has written for New York Magazine, among other places. She's been interviewed by the New York Times, and she has won the Tell Me Something I Don't Know contest hosted by Stephen Dubner. I was there to watch her do it. And so, Michelle McSweeney, please share with us some of the wisdom that you've accumulated on how to share linguistics with a hungry but often naive public.
Well, thank you for that very generous introduction. So I have to say that honestly, I'm pretty fortunate because I have studied text messaging. And I think you mentioned social media, and we're in this moment, right, where everyone is a cyborg. We are connected to our phones, we communicate with everyone around us, and that creates so much anxiety. So a lot of what I talk to the media about, and like the media that I create, revolves around that more than it revolves around like what I actually research, you know. So all the linguistic terms that are in my dissertation and are like, you know, very well spelled out and all of these things, or at least I think so, those are not what I ever talk to the media about, you know. I get interviewed now a lot for Elite Daily, which may not be the most prestigious publication, but the readership is enormous. And it's always things like, what are texting signs that, you know, your partner really likes you? Okay, that is so far from what my linguistic research is, but it gives me this opportunity to talk about language and then introduce like one little nugget and then go back to talk about the anxieties some more. I see you laughing, but people read this, you know?
I get it, yeah.
And I've made a podcast completely about this. It's called Subtext. You can see it there. Please check us out, iTunes, wherever you get your podcasts. And a lot of media contacts me through that. So our listenership is not huge, but I think that creating that hyper accessible thing and putting it out there has really driven a lot of media to me. Where, you know, I can then talk about things like LOL, or I can talk about things that people interact with. And I think that this is one of the beautiful things about language, right? Is that everyone that you're going to talk to has firsthand experience in it. You know, so you can always leverage what their experience is to introduce that, oh, there's a systematic principle going on behind here. And particularly in terms of text messaging, like people have so much anxiety, and like showing them that it's systematic and even labeling the phenomenon that's happening, I think people are inherently interested in because there's so much anxiety. It's like, I love working with journalists because, you know, they reach out and they say, oh, I want to interview you about this thing. And I'm like, okay, this person does not have the vocabulary that I would assume from like my classrooms, but this person is hyper interested. So if I can make it something relatable, they're going to put exact quotes into whatever they're writing. You know, if it's phenomena that the average person has experienced, Like for the Times, they interviewed me about laughter. And it was like LOL versus LMAO versus haha. And what does digital laughter look like? Well, everyone has had experience with digital laughter at this point. So it's this excellent opportunity to say, here is this really accessible thing that you never noticed before. And now I'm going to point it out and show that there's a principle that you can apply to other things, and trying to use as least amount of linguistic vocabulary as possible. So I think it intimidates people, honestly.
They don't want to. Mm-hmm.
No, they want to know what's going on,
Mm-hmm.
but they don't want the vocabulary.
They don't want to learn how to use all of these clumsy terms. They want to be enlightened, and frankly, there's a difference. Yeah,
Yes.
It takes practice.
Although some terms, so I work in tech now, and we were developing a classifier, machine learning, and I was like, okay, we're going to make it entailment based. And this word has caught on in a way that I do not stand behind, but it means something that has this linguistic root that can be used kind of internally. You know, I would call it strong implicature, what they call entailment, but that's cool. We're good.
And that's getting around. Good, good.
So that's a lot of what I do. Quite honestly, I've started consulting one-on-one text messaging, which forces me to talk about language in a way that someone else definitely understands.
How did you get that gig?
Through my podcast, 100%.
Okay.
So she heard the podcast, reached out. It's a woman who owns a dating consultancy, and was like, I need a texting expert, like someone who can read text messages and interpret them. I'm like, well, that's not me. Why?
Wait, Michelle, if I may, this is a genuine question. What is a dating consultancy?
Oh my goodness. We are in the era. So it's, I mean, everyone is online dating, right?
Right, yeah.
Right. And it's really hard. It's hard to write a profile. It's hard to understand that first text message. So a dating consultant helps you write the profile, helps you pick your pictures.
Okay.
Of course.
Okay.
So
I'm never participating in that. But no, that is a very important thing to have. Yeah.
But it also forces me and gives me immediate feedback from somebody who knows nothing about linguistics and honestly doesn't care. They just want to understand what's happening in their life, you know? And, you know, if that's someone who's paying you to do that, or if that's your best friend, you know, it's an incredible resource to be able to talk about it with somebody, run your ideas through somebody, and get that feedback.
Sure.
So,
well, that's very interesting, Michelle. So these are your adventures.
These are my adventures. These are my adventures with the media and the public.
What about the future?
The future?
Yeah.
Well, right now I am working in tech, like I said, but I'm also teaching at Pratt and the Graduate Center. And we'll see. We're trying to turn Subtext into a series of articles. And I'm working on a book about the word okay.
Oh, goodness gracious.
You are the first person to not say okay after that.
That is a wonderful idea. Well, Michelle, I'm gonna move on only because we have limited time, but thank you very, very much.
Thank you so much.
So folks, our next speaker is Ann Curzan, and she might not need any introduction if you are a partaker of TED Talks, because she has done one called What Makes a Word Real, and she writes a column for Lingua Franca, and she's the co-host of That's What They Say on Michigan's National Public Radio, and she is appointed between, and this is very appropriate given what she does, between English, linguistics, and education at the University of Michigan. And it's an honor to have you here, and I want to know, what do you have to tell us?
Well, thanks. I'm delighted to be here, and I realized I didn't quite know how this was going to work, so people are seeing me next to me, and we can see if I look like my photo. But I'm delighted to get this chance to talk about this kind of work in terms of presenting linguistics, and it had me thinking about this moment. It was a couple years ago, and I ran into a woman who listens to That's What They Say, which is a podcast. For those who don't know it, it's a show on our local Michigan radio, which is an NPR affiliate, plays in Southern Michigan, and it's 4 minutes every Sunday morning. And she said, you know, I listen to your show every Sunday, and I have realized that what you're really telling me is that I just need to chill out a little bit about language. And I thought, that is actually exactly what I am telling you. And I have never said exactly that. I talk about words, I talk about language change, but I don't actually say you all need to chill out about language change, need to judge each other less, but that is in fact what I'm up to. So the Sunday morning show is a little bit of context. It alternates with Will Short's puzzle. And so we're asked to kind of keep it in that spirit, which is that it will be light, it will be accessible. And so part of my challenge is to figure out, how do I present content that is accessible and fun on a Sunday morning, but still is making some points I really want to make about the fact that linguistic diversity is part of diversity, and that language change is a natural part of language. So that's sort of what I'm thinking about. And I've discovered that I spend a good amount of my time responding to people's peeves, because that's what they now write in about is, you know, Anne, I listened to your show and I don't like it when. And that's actually a wonderful time to get to, in a playful way, help people get over whatever it is that they're worried about. And the skill set I've developed in these 4-minute segments, because 4 minutes is actually not very much time, has been helpful. Right, so it's been helpful when I get interviewed for newspapers, when I've done other kinds of podcasts, is to think about how do you present information in a short period of time. So as I was thinking about this, I've come up with 4 take homes that I'm gonna, in hopes that they will be helpful. In addition to what Michelle was just talking about in terms of thinking about what language you use, because you don't want to overwhelm people with jargon. So the first one, and I actually think this is one of the most important ones, and John, I know you do this in your work as well, is to think about and take really seriously the beliefs that people come with. Mm-hmm. That, and then to address those beliefs, because if you dismiss those beliefs out of hand and just tell people that they're being silly, it is the way to lose trust before you've even started. Yep. And I think it's a place where we can sometimes, because we think, you know, how could you believe that that's wrong? Or how could you believe? Well, they do believe, a lot of people do believe these things, and they believe it because they learned it in school and they heard it from their parents. And so they have good reason to believe it, and they have a lot better reason to believe it, to believe all the things they learned in school, than to believe me, who they don't know and have never met. So I just think that to me, that is probably the most important takeaway, is to think about, okay, what do people think is true, and how can I help them rethink that thing? And to give a concrete example, I think about it, I talk a lot about singular they, very strong opinions about singular they.
Boy, nobody cares much about that.
Nobody, right, very, you know, slow topic. But I realized a few years ago, and it really changed the way I talked about it, that what I needed to do was shift the terms of the debate, that there actually was, and this was actually back when we were debating generic they as opposed to non-binary they. Mm-hmm. And with generic they, I realized that what I was trying to debate people on was, can it be singular? Which is actually not debatable, because it just is. Mm-hmm. But the debate we could have was, are you allowed to write it down? And when I started to talk about it that way, it helped, it sort of shifted the ground so that people could still express their discomfort about it and say, but I don't feel like I should write it down. And I said, okay, that's fair, but that's different from saying it can't be singular, because that's not an interesting debate for us to have. So that would be the first takeaway. The second one is that we do have to streamline information into shorter bits. So Michelle was talking about this as well. And I think related to that, I would say what I found is I don't use the verb simplify for that, because I don't think you necessarily have to simplify it in order to make it shorter. You have to make strategic choices. Sometimes you have to say, this is very complicated, but here's one way to think about it, which is to acknowledge that actually this is not totally adequate, but I can help you think this through. And that I find I decide where to nuance and where not to nuance. Right, so I think, okay, here I can make a more general point, but I really here I'm going to have to get a little more technical because otherwise it feels irresponsible to me. The third one I would say, and this is thinking more about if you're getting interviewed for a newspaper or television, is to think ahead about what you want to say and stay on message. Because I have found where my interviews have tended to go most wrong is where I try to, the interview's asking me something and it's not territory I feel very comfortable on, and I start to wander off into places where I don't actually really want to make an argument. And I found that usually they just want a good quote. And so if they ask me a question, I can usually spin it towards something that I actually want to say, and I have found that to be helpful.
I do exactly that. I've never heard anybody nail it that way. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And it makes me feel more confident going in of like, I have things I want to say about this. I'm excited to say about this, and I'm going to say about this. No matter what you ask me, I'm going to say that.
Yeah.
So, and then the fourth one, and this one is just sort of a bigger one, is I've just found that I think we have to be really patient. The idea that one podcast or one newspaper article or whatever, or 12 is going to help people completely change their minds about language is not going to happen. This is going to be a lot of work for years and years with lots of us working on it. And I think, okay, if I can just open the door a crack, like just help people see that maybe there is another reasonable way to think about this. Even if they disagree with me, they think, okay, I can see how she got there. And I think here about a wonderful quote from John Rickford, who he was here in Ann Arbor giving a talk about Black English and the Oakland controversy and Ann Arbor case. And people were saying, but why can't people rethink Black English? How many times do we have to say it's a legitimate dialect before people will understand this? And he said, and this has always stuck with me, he said, advertisers would laugh at us because we're pretty much like, we told you once, why didn't you listen? And advertisers know that you have to show an ad 100 different ways, thousands of times before anybody will even recognize your toothpaste in the drugstore. And I thought, that's exactly right, that we just have to be willing to say it again and again and again in different ways in hopes that it'll stick.
Yep. Those are 4 powerful points. And I thank you very much for them. And
it took me more than 4 minutes, though. I took a little more than 4 minutes.
That's okay. I should say that actually I have a rule about media in general, no matter what I'm talking about. You go in with 3 things. It's always 3, because 4 is too many, except for tonight, and 2 is not enough. And so I always think I'm going to say these 3 things. And exactly, almost no matter what they ask you, you make sure you say those 3 things, because just with some nice transitions and fillers and raisings of eyebrows, it'll seem coherent enough. And then you've done your job. I've always had that philosophy. Yeah, definitely. But thank you, Anne. Thank you very much. You do the same things I do. In any case, folks, I want to transition now to our next panelist, who is Daniel Midgley. And Daniel Midgley operates from very far away from where most of us are, not only Australia, but the part that most of us don't go to, Western Australia. Daniel is based in Perth, and he teaches linguistics at the University of Western Australia. He hosts a weekly radio show, not podcast, but radio show that's called Talk the Talk, about language and linguistics, and it's truly a breath of fresh air. And he also has a new podcast called Because Language. In any case, I'm sure that Daniel has many insights on how to get linguistics out there to a hungry but inexperienced public, and I'll bet he could tell you more about how he feels than I do. And so, Daniel, what's on your mind?
Well, hello, John, and thanks to everyone for putting on such a great show. I'm learning tons, and I just hope that I can put something out there. Well, I do Talk the Talk, it's a radio show every Tuesday morning on community radio, but it's also in podcast form out there, so you can get it anywhere that you get your podcasts. We are TalkPod on Twitter. My friends Ben and Hedvig. Hedvig's a linguist, Ben isn't, and so he's sort of the audience surrogate for the show. And then Hedvig and I bounce linguistic stuff off of him. We also have another thing that I do, the Speakeasy, which is on the Australian ABC. So when I say ABC, I mean the Australian Broadcasting Corporation. It was the kind of thing where they said, do you want to come in and do a thing? And it went so well, they said, well, do you want to come back next week? So I did, and then it's just been a weekly thing now for a couple of years. It's an older audience. Some of the folks are pretty prescriptive and cranky, but over time, we've managed to make some inroads. So what I want to do is share some suggestions for what I do when I'm creating a story. And if you're a researcher who wants to get your research out there, these are some things that you might want to consider, because this is what I'm looking for. You want to make sure that your storytelling is in order. Getting a narrative going is really important. So make sure that you have some sort of hook, some sort of connection between your topic and what they're likely to know. I loved the Pokemon story. There was an article by Stephanie Shih about the sounds of Pokemon names, and when there are certain sounds in them that you can predict the size and the power of them by how many syllables and what kind of sounds are in their names. Well, what a great hook. Everybody knows Pokemon, and now you can take what they know and just take it a little farther. Also, make sure you stress the applicability. Your audience might not care about certain things about your research, but they will care about others. Yesterday on the Speakeasy, I talked about reading to children and what kind of questions people ask children when they're reading to them. And it turns out that open questions like how and why are better than just simple yes and no questions. They make kids think more language development. So if you are an adult and you read to children, here's something that you can do, and that's good for them. There are some devices that I like to use when I'm sharing information that helps things be more sticky and not just go past. One is the secret knowledge. Everybody loves to have knowledge that maybe other people don't have, and so you can leverage that desire to be special in that way. We can say things like, well, you know, a lot of people will tell you that, and then fill in the blank. It's not okay to end a sentence with a preposition, but what I found out was, right? Okay, now they've got something different. Share the good news. If people feel worried about language, you can say, oh, well, hey, I've got some good news for you. Language isn't deteriorating, or fill in the blank. The surprise ending is also good. You're sharing the research. We didn't know what we were going to find, but then we found out that.
Yeah. Daniel, you know, I'm going to insert something very quickly. That could be, that's Segosu. I think that should be remembered. Secret knowledge, good news, surprise ending, Segosu. Those are three really important ways to make something fun. Anyway, go ahead.
I am definitely stealing that mnemonic device because it sounds very good. Thank you, John. Okay, and then the message. So I always try, we've heard this before, so this must be a good idea. I always have that one thing that I want to get out there, and it could be, you know, yep, language changes, or yep, it's normal for people to use language differently from each other, or just that one thing that you want to get out there. So if it goes somewhere where you don't want it to go, you can bring it back and bring your message in. And if you've gotten that, John, you got 3 things, but I can only manage 1. So if I can just get that one thing out there, that's great. Okay, next. Working with media folks is something that, like, I'm a media person, but also I go into the studio and I've got whoever's there for my weekly segment. There's a mindset that they have that you might have to work with a little bit and manipulate. So I'm telling you what I've found just so that you can be ready for that. They want to fill time in an entertaining way. That's what they're after. They have a news hole, they've got to fill it. They don't mind so much what you say, which kind of goes to my next point, and that is they want entertainment, and accuracy is nice too. They're naive folks, they're not linguists, so they might focus on strange things that you would never think of, or things that aren't necessarily true. And so how to correct misunderstandings is kind of important. A nice thing is that radio folks are typically they have this personality where they're able to put you at ease. You talk to them and you feel like you know them already. And that's a feature of people who work in this industry. So you will feel very calm. Don't worry about that. They will be nice. I've never, now some people have run into antagonistic people. I never have. I guess I've been very lucky. I've always found the kind of people that set you at ease. So that's, for me, usually the case. Your mileage may differ.
I would agree with that. That is definitely, that's definitely the case, yeah.
Okay, good. So you don't have to worry that, the relationship won't go well. No. Okay, next. And you don't, sometimes after the interview, you will say, why didn't I say this thing? Why, I wish I'd done that. You can't always leave it all on the field, and there will be another day to talk. But as long as you've gotten your one message out there, that's probably what you want. And then, prescriptive attitudes, you will run into a lot of that, especially on talkback, which is what the speakeasy is. But it may take a while. You will get them to come around. And what's very heartening for me is that after 6 months, when my friend Nadia Mitsopoulos on the ABC took the words out of my mouth and said, so, language changes, I guess. Well, great, she said it for me. Or my friend Paula Kruger, who said, it sounds like what you're saying is that if everybody keeps doing the wrong thing, it turns into the right thing. I couldn't do better than that. So it does work. Minds do change. Just keep it positive and persist. Finally, a few talkback tips, and then I'll stop. I'm getting way too many points out there.
You're fine.
Listeners call in with questions or comments, and some of them are grumpy comments, and some of them are good comments. Be kind. They put themselves out there so that, not so that you could kick them around, but you can be positive. The message you're trying to get is, hey, language is fun and it's something we can talk about and it's nice. And then, there we go. Grumpiness is common, so you can help them ungrump. And just some short tips. Find common ground. A lot of people are cranky about language because they like language. And they learned in school that this attitude is the one that you should take. You can find common ground by saying, hey, I like language too. You like doing the right thing in language? Hey, I like doing the right thing too. But, and this is where you redirect their passion, you say, did you know that there's a different way of looking at it? We can tell better stories. The story that most people carry around with them is, I'm a smart person who uses language properly and other people are not using it properly. But we can tell better stories. We can say, did you know the thing about, and then fill in the blank. Did you know that singular they has been used for a really long time? It's been used longer than singular you. And one of the things I love about language is that you can use it to blow minds. And there are a lot of mind-blowing facts. Even in your own research, find out what it is that is interesting. And you can do that by talking to people, what's your research about? And then when you start talking, do their eyes glaze over? What's that one thing they catch on? Because that's going to be the thing that gets them in. All right, that's way too many things, but it all sort of came out. Thanks for listening.
Daniel, you know what the money one was. I had never thought of this. Singular they is older than singular you. That's good. I'm stealing that. I will give you credit. Actually,
I think you're stealing it from Dennis Barron, so check out him. He's the pronoun.
Did that? That's amazing. Anyway, Daniel, thank you very much, especially for the segosu with some tobiko and soy sauce. Absolutely perfect. And so, with that counsel, we can move on to our fourth and final panelist. And that would be Geoff Nunberg. And, I think most of you know who he is. He doesn't need an introduction, but I'm going to give him one anyway. Geoff, if we're going to be technical, is working right now at Berkeley's School of Information, but I think he's more familiar in this realm for the pieces that he's been doing for Fresh Air for decades. My favorite book of the great many that Geoff has written is one called The Ascent of the A Word. And the A Word was one that, I don't know, propriety may dictate that I shouldn't say it, but the subtitle was Assholism, the First 60 Years. You can learn a great bit about not only that word, but language from this particular book. In any case, many of us have looked to Geoff Nunberg for a long time as our model of being a linguist in service to the general public. And Geoff, I wonder what you'd like to tell us tonight.
Well, thanks, John, and thank you not just for those words, but for the very flattering review of the A-word book that you wrote for the New Republic some years ago. So, I took the title for these slides just from a sentence I heard from my Fresh Air producer. I was writing my singular they piece, as everybody else here has done or will do, and I want to make the distinction between singular they, or whatever you want to call it, with definite and indefinite antecedents. So I wanted to distinguish somebody named Pat lost their wallet, which has been standard colloquial English since Jane Austen was walking the earth, and Pat lost their wallet, which is a sentence that gets lots of people worked up. And to make that point, I wanted to talk about definite and indefinite antecedents, but my producer said, no, Geoff, you can't use antecedent on NPR. I couldn't use definite either. And I actually looked back to see how William Safire had dealt with that, and he had said something like, the word the pronoun stands in for antecedent. And it struck me that was good enough. But I take it as representing this problem of communication, of getting the idea across without, as Anne said, without having to excessively simplify what you're doing. What I want to do in the little time I have here is to, and you can go to the next slide if you like, is to repeat some of the things I tell my PhD students in a pro seminar that we have at the School of Information, where we give one class aimed at enabling them to communicate their ideas, their research, to a wider public. And in this connection, I draw heavily not just on my own experience, but the experience of my wife, who spent many, many years doing PR for high-tech startups and had the same problem of having to translate the ideas of these engineers and tech wonks and so on into language that a journalist and hence an ordinary audience could understand. One of the first things you want to ask yourself if you have stuff you want to put out there is, where should it go? For me, my experience was first in print with the New York Times and the Atlantic, and then on NPR. I've been doing that for 30 years. NPR I think of as the last bastion of the old media. It's like sort of one of those little Appalachian hollows where they're allegedly still speaking Elizabethan English. You know,
it never changes. That's right.
It never changes. But the media landscape over the last 30 years, since I started doing my NPR broadcast, has become so variegated that there are just a huge number of potential venues for interesting ideas about language. There are science websites like EON and others. There are numerous language websites. There are general magazines. I say magazines, but I mean things like The Atlantic and The Daily Beast and so on and so forth. Alumni magazines I'll come to in a moment. And then podcasts we've heard about and public radio and so on. So it's easier than it used to be to find a public venue for your ideas. It's also, because there are so many voices out there, harder to get heard. Just because you're competing for so much attention with so many other sites. So what do you want to do? And if you go to the next slide, you want to ask yourself some questions. Where is this going? That is to say, pick a venue. You're going to write for The Atlantic. You're going to write for your university. Alumni magazine. I should mention that of the resources you have at your disposal, the two most important are the LSA, particularly now that the LSA has really taken a role in helping to publicize linguistics research, and the what you call the comms office, the PR office, whatever it is, the communications office of your university. which has a lot of people, well, even if it's a small university, a lot of people whose job it is to publicize the research of their scholars, to impress the alumni, to impress maybe the state legislators, to impress donors, to make the scholars feel good. They will probably almost every day post on the homepage of the university, among the other stories, new students coming, dorm opens, and so on. There'll be one, OSU researcher discovers XYZ. They will work with the alumni office to publish a slick alumni magazine that will feature every month the work of one or two other scholars. And if wherever you went to college, you still receive that magazine because they have people who track you down, track their alumni.
It's astonishing how good they are at that.
Yeah. And they're very slick and they're very well done. And they also handle what PR people call incoming. That is to say, when there's a story, the Berkeley City Council changes its ordinances to adapt gender neutral pronouns, as have a number of cities like Philadelphia, Miami, Fairbanks, Alaska, and so on. That story gets out. The local TV or radio outlet, KNBC, whatever it is, calls the university and says, well, do you have somebody who can talk to us about this? And the university, if they're doing their job, they have you or somebody else in their Rolodex to give to the store, to the TV station, to the magazine, whatever it is, so that you can speak about this, and you then become a fixture in their Rolodex of that medium, and they're going to call you again and again and again. So you want to work with your university comms office. Maybe your chairman or chairperson should be doing that, but that's an important direction. Whenever you're talking to the media, an important thing to understand, I think other people have made this point in another way, language is not a beat. If you go to a publication like The Guardian or the San Francisco Chronicle or whatever, the Daily Beast, there will be people there whose job it is to cover healthcare, education, tech, the economy, and so on and so forth. And if they get a story in one of those areas, those are the people who cover that story. If you have a language story, with very few exceptions, there's almost certainly no one whose job it is to cover language.
Never heard of it.
Somebody who's an education writer, a tech writer, if it's an internet story, maybe just the feature writer who's writing this and is next going to write about the next TikTok dance craze or something.
Mm-hmm.
And you're going to have to be communicating with somebody whose background is slighter than it would be if they were covering another area. You have to tell them, what do they need? Why do they need, and why they want this information? Why is this interesting? Why is this important to people? You have to work up a story for that, and I think Daniel was giving some ideas about how you do that. You have to consult what they already know and what they already believe, and we've all been talking about that. I tend to be not pessimistic, but my sense is that the resistance to correction of linguistic attitudes will always be with us in some way. I have a theory as to why that's the case, but that we can make headway in a lot of domains. Why are you telling this story now? Is there a hook? Is there a hook, meaning a news story that you can hook it to? Did your city just pass change its ordinances to accept gender neutral pronouns? How many languages does Pete Buttigieg speak? Did tool making pave the way for language? Are Americans losing their language skills? How is immigration changing language? Is Fredo a slur? A piece I'm just thinking of the topic I'm just working on. Does texting ruin language? That's a weekly feature. So these things are just bubbling up to the surface all the time, and you want to look around when you see a piece to which you can hook your research or your interest. That should be the point of entry, and that's what journalists want to hear. And finally, again, picking up on what Daniel said, tell me a story. The importance of anecdotes, of personal anecdotes about individuals, of Little story. My wife said to me that when she has to explain what her husband does, and she gets the how many languages does he speak question, she tells the people who are asking one of several anecdotes. One of them is from Chuck Fillmore. Chuck once observed that English has two pairs of size adjectives, which can be combined in various ways. You can say big and little, you can say big and small, you can say large and small, but we don't say large and little. Wonderful little
That's
observation.
something only he would have noticed.
Yeah.
Right.
He picks these things up like a leaf that he found in the garden. And people say, gee, that's interesting. How come is that? And so, or she does the abso-fucking-lutely story, which in fixation is also, but
Always
there
right.
are little anecdotes like that that you can kind of keep in reserve that do pique people's curiosity about aspects of language, in particular the unconscious knowledge of rules, of which they're not generally aware. So those are some of the things that I think about, and I do think we can make progress and as John says, linguistics is no longer quite as abstruse or recondite or alien a field as it once was.
I would definitely agree with that. Definitely people like anecdotes. And thank you very much for that, Geoff. And I think that we've arrived at the portion where I'm supposed to say a couple of things along the lines of things that I've learned. And I don't want to take up too much time, but I would say that two things that I keep in mind other than the 3 rule, especially when the media only want you for so little time, is that the public likes to hear things that are counterintuitive. I try very hard not to share with the public things that they probably already knew or that confirm what they already thought, whether that was about prescriptivism or anything else. And so to tell them something like that indigenous languages tend to be more complex than big urban ones. People like to have their brains played with in that way, to tell them that the question is not why is Russian so complicated, but why is English so much unlike Russian? Or to tell people something like that women often are the leaders of language change. For reasons that we could discuss for a long time, some people seem to think that maybe it would be men who are in the lead. For goodness, why might they think that? But if you teach people that women are in the lead in language change, not only does it prick up their ears, but then you can talk about all sorts of fun linguistic phenomena like the switch from third person singular TH to third person singular S, which was led by women, which is also just fun to talk about even if you weren't talking about language and gender. Counterintuitive, I think, is the heart of what makes science interesting. And that's especially the case when, as Geoff has told us, there is no such thing as a language beat. Indeed, the person who's talking to you from the media really may be the person who otherwise does food. Those people are often omnivorous intellectually, and suddenly they're asking you about language. That's actually happened to me in the past. And so that means that you want to share with people that which blows their minds to some extent. And then the second and here final thing that I would mention is that I try very hard to try to remember what it was like to be a baby, not literally, but trying to imagine what it was like to be linguistically game but naive. And something that always sticks with me is this thing that I passingly read in the paper once a few years ago. There was somebody, a very intelligent and dedicated person, who was trying to help revitalize the Cherokee language. And this is somebody who's dedicating a lot of their life to teaching people this language that's in danger of eclipse. And at one point, she said to the interviewer, I've learned lately that if instead of giving the language in chunks, I actually break the long words down into their pieces and explain what each one of the little pieces does, it's more effective. In other words, this person who's dedicated and intelligent but not linguistically trained had never had occasion to think about the fact that there isn't only words and expressions, but that there's also what we linguists would call grammar. Like, she knew the grammar, she could use the grammar, but she had not been taught. How would she have learned that if people are going to learn Cherokee, you can't just teach them the words and the expressions, you have to teach them how to mark the past tense and how to mark so very many other things. That gave me a sense. This is how one might think of language without the kinds of tools that we can sometimes forget we even have. And so I try very hard to imagine, how would I have felt about this when I was 7 or 8, or in my case, frankly, even 18? What would I have thought? Because I think it ends up making us better teachers. But at this point, I would like, and I think the four of you would like to know what our audience has in terms of questions. And so shall we now open it up to the questions?
Could I just interpolate one thing, John, one point that your work on Lexicon Valley brings to mind is that in as much as most of those of us who are talking today do oral work, either on radio or podcast or so on. Mm-hmm. John is who's brilliant, I think, expositions on Lexicon Valley works so well because he incorporates sound. He incorporates sound clips periodically, and that's an enormous advantage that you get with oral medium. Of course, in John's case, they're also drawn from a stupefyingly comprehensive knowledge of the American musical theater. But but the use of sound is one thing that not just public radio, but podcasting really makes available, and there's a new dimension to this kind of.
Definitely.
Sorry.
So, David, I imagine that you would be responsible for the technological transition here that involves opening up to the audience.
Yep, so if all of the panelists can turn their cams on, and for those of you in the audience, as I mentioned earlier, if you have questions, please ask them using the questions widget that you have there. And if your question is for a specific panelist, please let us know which one it's for. So we await your questions, and until someone sends a question, is there anything any of you would like to add?
Well, I'm at home, so I'm going to put on glasses, which very few linguists ever see me in. I'll add that. Okay.
Well, Daniel, I was thinking about the point you made about trying to find common ground with audiences, which I loved. And I was thinking about that I actually often share with people that I have peeves. Right? I mean, to say to people, like, I have things that I think, could the language not change that way? That if I could pick, that isn't what would happen. And then talk to people about, okay, but does anyone care that Anne Curzan doesn't like the word impactful? And the answer is no, that doesn't matter. And so sort of helping people own the peeve, to sort of say, yes, I have them too. And then what I've learned to do is kind of manage what I call the inner commando, kind of talk to it and say, you don't have good ground to stand on here, so don't correct your students and don't be mean to other people about this. So I like that point of kind of trying to humanize us too, to say it's not that everything we're like, it's all great. Like sometimes stuff happens and it grates on us too, but that's okay.
Yeah.
And John, we've been getting some questions, and I believe I'm forwarding them to you. Can you see them?
I desperately want to say yes. However, I would have to learn where to find them.
I think they would be in your questions widget.
Okay, there is something that says that, and I've hit question. And what I'm seeing is perhaps somebody has asked topics popular in the media. Is that the question?
Yeah, and if you maybe there's a right above where it says questions, there's a sort of a square box with an arrow that will make it bigger so that you can see the entire question.
You're so polite. Okay, so question, and then I hit this little arrow. Topics popular in the media, and then about it. Now you're saying that where I could make this bigger?
So on the upper right corner of that box, of the questions box, there should be a little, looks like a little square with an arrow in it.
Yes.
And if you hit that one, it should expand the whole box.
I'm going to hit the square. Our problem is solved. Okay, here we go.
Okay.
Okay. How can we appropriately address the topics we feel are important as linguists while still addressing topics popular in the media? And apparently that question was asked of me. And I would say that you would start, and I'll bet all the panelists would agree with this, is that you start with what is popular. And I try to listen for what people want to know, because frankly, the overlap between what people most want to know and what interests me is approximate. but you try to get a sense of what it is that people want to know and why they want to know it and try to have respect for it. And then I try to slide in the things that I think they should know through the back door on the basis of those sorts of things that they want to hear about. And so is texting ruining language? Well, you do have to answer that question. You have to understand why people would think of it. And next thing you know, you're giving them a lesson in what grammar is. Next thing you know, you're teaching them what pragmatic as opposed to semantic is. And there are all sorts of ways that you could go in that sort of direction. Does anybody else have something they would want to pitch in on that? Michelle?
Exactly that, honestly, that, you know, lead with the candy is what I often say. That, you know, people are coming because they want something, so give that to them. Because then you've built a relationship and they're going to trust you more when you pivot to talk about whatever you want to talk about, you know.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's the lead. I mean, you want to think of whatever that point is as your lead, L-E-D-E as it's spelled, and work your way from that lead, whether Fredo's a slur or texting's ruining language or whatever, to the points you want to make about grammar or whatever, pragmatics and semantics or whatever, and getting from the lead that gets them, that hooks them, to the points you want to make is where the art comes in.
Yeah.
I've said that writing is 90% is 10% perspiration, 10% inspiration, and 80% transitions. You want to make that transition.
It is true. Daniel, the next question is one where I think you might be a good person to kick off an answer, and that is, how should linguists best represent endangered indigenous languages to the media without exoticizing them? Those of us who work with languages other than English have to overcome various forms of linguistic ethnocentrism. This is important, and I'm asking you because of the obvious, you know, indigenous languages of Australia, a topic that must come up at least a bit in your life. What would you say to that?
Yeah, that's one of the things that we're doing these days. Every episode we do an Australian Indigenous Word of the Week. And we actually get people who speak these languages, Australian Aboriginal people, on the show. We have their voices. We don't just say, oh, here's the word for butterfly. The danger is in exoticization. Yeah, oh, look at this unusual thing. My remedy is to exoticize English. Show how weird English is. I mean, not weird, but oh, look at this thing that's done. But that's not so different because lots of languages handled it this way. Like, for example, this Australian language doesn't use the, it doesn't use articles, but lots of languages don't use the, like Russian or da-da-da-da-da. So always put it in the context of, hey, there are lots of strategies that language can use. This is one strategy, and we might do it differently, or we might do it the same, or here's a point of contact between English and this language. So it's not so weird after all. Ta-da.
Here's another one. And Michelle, I think this might be you. So far, most of my contacts with the media, not mine, but the question, so far, most of my contacts with the media have been questions from journalists writing about ethical considerations with NLP technology. This is print journalism, and I'm often worried that they're going to misquote me. What are the best practices around this? Just not worry about it, or?
So when I work with journalists, especially internationally, but also knowing just all the journalists that I work with, they are busy and they are on deadline. So whenever possible, I ask them if I can do it in writing. Because if I can turn it around to them quick, they are going to be able to pick that quote up and put that quote in. I mentioned that I do a ridiculous amount of experting for Elite Daily. And when they contact me, I basically write the entire article for them. And then they spruce it up and make my writing way better. But whenever possible, especially when working with technical things, it's really important to be able to try to get it in writing. If they won't do it in writing, then ask them to verify the quotes. Many journalists, at least in my experience, will do that if I've talked to them about really technical things, like the work that I do at my company. they'll come back and ask me to verify the quotes because it gets kind of technical pretty quickly. But if they don't volunteer that, politely ask them, saying, this can get really complicated. Could I see the quotes before you publish them? If you can't do it in writing.
Okay. This next one is
just add one thing to that. I think what Michelle says is right, and what Anne was saying also about quotes is terribly important. I think you want to think in terms of giving them what journalists call the pull quote. That's the quote that pops up in a little box or in larger letters in the middle of a story. That's short, that's trenchant, that makes the point in a punchy way. And if you give them that sentence, they'll love you for it, and they will use it exactly as you gave it to them.
Anne, this is one that I would like you to kick off. Geoff might have some thoughts on it too, but a person asked, and I knew somebody was going to ask this, the panelists and the moderator are all established with the media. Do you have advice or advices? I like that. That's that European advices. Have advices on how to break through. How did you break through, and how long did it take? This is a good question. How do you do it? And how did you get where you are? What do you do?
I want to know this.
How'd you get in there?
Yeah. I mean, I feel like, and I hate answers like this, which is, some of it was lucky. But, John, you and I have both done great courses. Mm-hmm. And that was one of the ways that people found me.
That's a good answer. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Was that, so for those people who don't know, so the teaching company does these audio video courses, and the way they found me was they fish. They pretty much go to university campuses and fish, as in they say, who gives a good lecture, who's a good teacher, and then they contact you and say, can I come sit in on your class?
That's
and
all
I
they
actually
do.
I remember them contacting me and saying, we're on campus Wednesday, can we come sit in your class? And I said, well, I'm in the syntax unit, I'm doing parts of speech. If you want to come hear about adjectives and adverbs, come on in. And, they came and sat in the front row to see what I did. And so I think that people knew my name to some extent from that, and that I could present information in a way that was sort of more broadly accessible to people. I volunteered at some point to be on the LSA website as an expert. And so I think people who are interested in getting involved, as far as I know, David's always sort of interested in hearing from people who would like to be listed as an expert on a particular thing, so that when a journalist is looking on our website or contacting David to say, can somebody talk to me about whatever it is, then they can send the journalist our way. So there is I don't know if the rest of you have found this, there's a kind of snowballing to it, which is hard to then say, how do you kind of find the snow?
Right.
But, I think in some ways, Geoff, you were talking about this starting locally. So can you talk, if you're at a university, can you talk with the news and communications people about doing a little story about your work? Is there a local radio station that might be interested in doing an interview with you about something? Can you write an editorial in your local paper about, to sort of start to get out there a little bit, starting more locally?
And I think that's particularly useful now when the local media are accessible nationally. Mm-hmm. So if you say something interesting about NLP or pronouns or whatever in the San Francisco Chronicle or the LA Times or whatever, it's accessible to other people who are doing a search on pronouns, gender, whatever, and they'll find you that way too, in a way in which they couldn't have when that was just something that was sold in news boxes around the city.
You know what else? I think that the snowballing part is important. It gets to a point where you just have a kind of momentum. And so the question is, how did you ever get started? And yes, the great courses helps. The stretch that they have, the scope that they have, the amount of people who hear you and write to you is absolutely astonishing. But then many people are here probably then thinking, yes, but suppose nobody comes and watches me. How do I get to do a great course? Although that definitely is a wonderful beginning. It also helps to write books, which I did not necessarily do in the beginning myself, but to write books that are likely to grab an audience. And Michelle, I'm not just saying this to you because you're there, and I'm not saying that you chose that topic cynically, But a book about the word okay, that is dead on. That is something that the public is going to eat up with a spoon, from old Kinderhook down to how it's used on, the internet, etc. And that's the sort of thing that people want to read. Or I wrote the language hoax about the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, not cynically, I sold it for a song, but the idea was people are going to want to hear about that. And then I can just throw in all of my other linguistics tidbits because that's what I want to do. But books shouldn't be too long. And it's not just any old book, especially these days when people read ever fewer of them, and especially nonfiction ones. But handy, littleish books about something people really care about are a way of getting yourself out there too. The great courses are kind of that, but you can also do it as what's called a book. And it also helps to read your own book, to have your audiobook, so your personality is in it. Hint, hint, Michelle. So that is, go ahead, Ann.
Sorry, it's hard to know how to not interrupt here, but because I completely agree, and then I can imagine people in the audience thinking, but I don't have time to write a book, which would be fair. So I do think for those of you who are at universities, thinking about how you can use the infrastructure at your university. Many of us, our colleges have alumni magazines. There are ways to, if you have a study and you think there's a way to spin this that could be interesting to people and accessible to people, I have certainly found that many universities are looking for stories about faculty working on things that other people will be interested in. And if we can volunteer and say, here's a great way to spin this study I just did that I think people will be interested in, they'll jump. They're like, great, there's a story that our alums will see the kind of research we do and why it matters in the world. And so I would say that can be maybe a more accessible place to start.
And
it's also, if I can just build on what John was saying, if you are going to write a book, who knows whether that's a good idea or not, you want to turn yourself into a good, and here's a word that I know must be on Ann's peeves list, a good platform. That is to say, the person who can go out and appear on YouTube and give good interviews and so on. Having done that a couple of times, you will get that build to a snowball effect too much, because they'll look at YouTube and they'll say, oh, look at this person, she was great on the TED Talk, in her TED Talk on what's a word, and let's do her for an interview or whatever.
Right, and so people know there are local TED Talks, right? So for many of us, if you can try to find a way to get even in a TEDx event somewhere near you, that, as Geoff's saying, can be a way to sort of get yourself out there in a way that people can find you on the web. Sorry, Michelle.
And this is Michelle, did you want to say something?
Only in a different direction. Go ahead.
Well, I just want to interject. Some people are going to be asking, well, how do you do a TED Talk, Ann? And I know the way that I did it was I was asked to do a TEDx, and then that led to doing, quote unquote, real TED. And of course, why did they ask me to do that? Because I already had the foot in the door. How did you get into TED? What was your TED story?
You may notice, actually, I've only done a TEDx talk. Mine was a TEDx talk that got picked up on the National TED website, but it was a talk here in Ann Arbor. So I've actually never, know that. I have never done a national TED talk.
But they grabbed you.
The TEDx talk. Yeah, right. So the national site picks up, I think, a talk a day. They pick up a TEDx talk every day and put it on the national site. So,
but they asked you to do the TEDx talk. How did that happen?
They seem to just there's the local, so the local TEDx had put it up on the Ann Arbor TEDx U of M website, and then there is, I think if I have this right, there's a national TEDx site, and they pick up a certain number of TEDx talks and put them on the national TEDx site, and then the national TED Talk site goes to the national TEDx talk site and picks up one talk a day that they then put. So mine kind of just bubbled up through the system.
Interesting. Michelle,
if I can add one little anecdote about the importance of doing local media. I had written an article for The Atlantic that they ran as a cover story about grammar. The American Heritage Dictionary was looking for somebody to work with. Dwight Bollinger gave them my name, which is a great honor to be selected by Dwight. I worked with them. They sent me, when the new edition came out, on a tour of all these little afternoon talk shows in all these cities. And I did one with this interesting woman in Philadelphia, 3-hour afternoon talk show, we hit it off. And 2 years later, when she decided to do a national show and call it Fresh Air, she called me and
Interestingly,
as they say. I mean, they say hitch your wagon to a star, but who knew, right? So it was a case, though, of just doing a little local interview and having it balloon into something else.
Could I just give some advice? Oh, sorry, Michelle, you go and then I'll take it.
The only other thing that I would add is to apply to everything. So like I did the 5-Minute Linguist, which is an amazing platform. I will never give another talk at a conference with that many people in the audience. I applied to tell me something I don't know, and applied to just everything. The other thing that I know has helped is maintaining my personal website. And that is something everyone can do. Almost certainly your institution has some sort of platform for really easy making a website. And just having a professional page up there, like something that looks tidy and clean, because, you know, people will Google, like journalists will just Google for someone who's an expert in something vaguely related to what you're doing. So with a little bit of SEO hacking, you can get yourself to bubble up. So just think about what journalists would be Googling, or someone who doesn't know about linguistics would be Googling, and try to put those keywords in your site. Yeah. David.
Dan,
Daniel.
I was going to say, please don't knock back the opportunities that come your way. Sometimes I've gone to linguists and said, hey, is it okay if people call, because the radio opportunities have been coming so fast, and so it's so snowbally for me that I'm actually assembling a list of linguistic super friends that I can now divert media people to. Call them, try them, they're really good. And sometimes they'll say, oh, but I don't really, that's not my research area. I don't really know anything about that. Just take it. Just take it. You know a lot more than the general public. You're a person with the right mindset. You can get good messages out there. Just use that as a hook. Learn enough in 15 or 30 minutes to be able to do a thing about it, just to be able to talk about it. And it can really grow from there.
Being a generalist, I have a depressing question here. And I think any of you might want to pitch in on this one. I've been contacted a handful of times concerning my opinion on a linguistic matter, but the few times that I've tried to pitch something proactively have been almost universally met with no response. Any suggestions? Is pitching a story a fool's errand? What would you tell this person who, well, I'm not going to reveal who it is, but you know, this person does not deserve to be turned down all the time. And so how do you make it so that you start getting your pitches answered?
Writing a good pitch letter is a skill that it would take some time to develop. But there are these publications that are looking for, and websites and so on, that are looking for interesting material. And if you write them a good pitch letter, you say, I'm a linguist, blah, blah, blah. I want to write a story on XYZ. Give them the right sort of background, tell them how long it will be. They may very well say, send it to us, we'd be delighted to. And I've done that several times, and just cold pitches, and you know, they pick it up. You have to, again, look at the publication, look who their readers are, look at what they do, look at what their interests are, and write to that to that audience and that editor, and it can happen. It does happen.
Yeah, so I have sort of the same reaction, which is I think find a journalist or four and have them look at the pitches you've been sending, because it's, and I do not claim expertise here on how to write a good pitch, but it is an art to how to do that. And journalists are really good at it, and they'll tell you, and we have a journalism fellowship program here, and they just sort of say academics are not good at this off the bat. Like we need some help in terms of figuring out how to write a pitch. And Geoff, and as you were talking, I was thinking a thing we haven't mentioned, but I think we should in terms of people who are trying to get their foot in the door is the conversation, right? As an online publication that, you know, is sort of nicely situated for people who are trying to get some work out there in a more accessible way, and often then does get them more national attention. Some of those stories get picked up in a national way.
And again, that's one indication of the how variegated this media world is now, the landscape is, and how easy it is to find a home or a place to go.
Somebody writes, this is also challenging. I saw something on Linguist Twitter. Is that a thing?
Yes, it is. It's totally a thing.
I just figured I was on Twitter with a lot of links. I saw something on Linguist Twitter the other day that suggested that successful public outreach through podcasts, etc., doesn't necessarily translate into academic success. Necessarily, no. What has been your, as in all y'all's, experience as an academic balancing your presence in academia as well as in the public eye? What has it been?
Oof. I might be the wrong person to do this because I enjoyed doing media and outreach so much. Okay, and this is another thing, right? We're expected to do a lot of free work as academics. And so everyone says, do outreach, it's great, but resources aren't provided by our universities to actually appreciate the outreach work that we do. We're just expected to do it on top of everything else. I chose to do less academic and to go for a non-traditional career where I could do the outreach that I wanted to, because I felt it was more me and I felt happier doing it. So my advice for balancing academic and outreach is just don't do academic stuff, just do outreach. That's probably really terrible advice, so I'm gonna cede the floor to other people.
Daniel, I have no other advice. I took the same route.
Well, look, my sense is that if you have a solid research portfolio, I mean, you've got to be a real solid researcher, then your university is often very happy to have you be also known to a wider public. You must be a colleague of that wonderful Ann Curzan who teaches whatever, so on and so forth. Or the comms office, as I say, will call and say we've got, and the administration likes it, the trustees like it. It's a feather in their cap that you are there, and it's not, as I say, as if that will take the place of a solid body of research, but it's a nice thing to add to it.
Yeah. So.
And you're going to say what I'm going to say anyway. Go ahead, because we've talked about this. Go ahead.
Oh gosh. Okay. Well, I'm going to say something, and then you're going to say the thing I don't say.
Right.
So I have had a more traditional academic career in that I have been at the University of Michigan, got tenured here, got promoted to full here, and made some strategic decisions about, I think within the first 3 or 4 years of being in the academy, I knew I wanted to do more public facing work. But I also knew I'm at a Research One institution, and that if I didn't have a book in an English department, I wasn't going to get tenure. And so, want to be really candid with people about, I made some strategic decisions, and I finished what I sometimes affectionately refer to as my tenure book, so that I could know that I could do that. And then once I got tenure, that's when I started to diversify my portfolio. That's when I started to started working on a textbook. I started doing more public talks because I felt like, okay, now I can start to follow those commitments. But there was some strategy involved in that because I decided I wanted to stay in the academy. I knew that if I did primarily public facing work before tenure, I wouldn't get tenure. That was the reality of that. And so you could leave, or you could sort of work within the system.
That's
so
what
John,
I
what were you
thought.
going to say?
That you get your tenure, your first 7 years, and you're probably not going to have time. I kind of did for eccentric reasons, but that was an accident. Probably you're not going to have much time for that for the first 7 years. Then you branch out. And in terms of how to balance it, as far as I'm concerned, you do both of them. It takes a lot of time. You become the kind of person who is said to have too much to do. But to me, frankly, nothing is more satisfying than writing an academic paper, squeezing it past the referees, and seeing it published. To me, that's the best thing. It sits right where I live. And then 7 people read the paper. Whereas when you do public-facing work, you feel like you're having some sort of effect on the world. That's fun, but I must admit, nothing that I do in that realm, even Lexicon Valley, quite hits the spot like writing some abstruse paper with long sentences about something very particular. I need both myself. And if anything, the way that I take some of the burden off is that when I do academic work that I know nobody's going to read, I do always have a kind of a little bird sitting on my shoulder wondering what part of this might you translate into a book or a couple of podcasts, etc. And to be honest, I probably wouldn't do something where it couldn't possibly yield anything for the public. I look at Indo-European study from afar, people talking about Hittite and Luvian, and I think I'd like to do that, but I couldn't squeeze anything out of that for anybody but about 300 people, and therefore I'll never touch it. So partly I like there to be some sort of overlap, but yeah, it means you have a lot of work to do. But the idea that the public work is going to enhance your academic profile, no, not at all. If anything, there's always going to be a slight suspicion that you don't really have the chops. You can't even hope that being on podcasts is going to enhance your career as a nuts and bolts academic. They're completely different things. And so you have to be two people.
Although I would reiterate Jeff's point, I do think, I mean, I agree with that, but also universities do like having people who are recognized in a broader way.
In that sense, they do, yes, definitely. Yeah, they eat that up, actually. Yeah, they want you around once you're established doing that. David, I'm not sure where you are virtually in this setup, but we have hit what is supposed to be the ending point of our session in terms of time. How do we manage that?
So I am still here, and if you are all willing, I think we started a few minutes late, and we could go on for another 5 minutes and take another question or two.
Want to do another one?
If you're all willing to, and yeah.
Okay.
This is important. How do we get funding for outreach activities so people aren't doing it for free? Someone asks. That could be to anyone. Funding for outreach activities so that people aren't doing it for free.
Somebody tell me.
I pay for hosting out of pocket.
Yep.
Occasionally, universities do support this kind of thing. I was thinking of the NPR show, the public radio show Philosophy Talk, which Ken Taylor and John Perry have been doing for a number of years with Stanford support. And, you know, the NPR real estate is closed off, you can almost get, but they have a number of stations. They've had some success with it. So there are, and they also use contributors and so on. It's a gangbuster show, and they have managed to get support from the university. And I don't know what the situation is at Michigan or whatever, but and I don't think Berkeley does that, but it can happen.
Yeah, so it's a really interesting question, and it's clear all of us are looking at each other like, who's got something there? The thing that comes to mind is, again, for people at universities, is you could approach your university to see if they're willing to sponsor something like the op-ed project, which will come to the university and train 20 or 25 people, faculty members, about how to write op-eds. At Michigan, we've had some conversations about, can we do some training of our own scholars on public speaking, on public writing. So you could approach your university about, again, because it gets back to Jeff's point that universities, many of them are now prioritizing that kind of public facing work, or at least, John, as you were saying, asking us to do it on top of other things. And to go and say, are you willing to put some resources behind some training for faculty if you want us to do this, because you need to build some infrastructure here to do it. So that, I don't know that it's there, but I would say you might, for people who can, go to some administrators and see if they might be willing to build something using either internal resources or some external coaches or consultants or things like that.
And as John knows, there is such a thing as writing a book proposal, getting an advance, which can be usually not a stupendous, but a substantial amount of money, and even royalties. Nobody gets royalties anymore. You just get the advance, but even the prospect of royalties down the line.
And also, it's also that foot in the door. Once you've got one book, like let's say you start with one of these cod salt books about a really neat topic and people are going to buy it. Then in terms of your advances, you get more if the first book did well. And so then it ends up building step by step. So once you get that foot in the door, then yeah, book advances can fund a lot of what you would want to do. Because no, it's not stupendous, but then it's also not just $2,500.
And that
so
takes you down another road that we haven't talked about, and that would take almost another session to discuss. But if this is a line you want to pursue, then you have to talk about agents, and you have to talk about even about publicists. Your publisher, if you publish with, as John does, with a major house, is going to have a strong PR person or publicist who will arrange those media shows if they're good, and arrange the appearances in bookstores in Keokuk or wherever, and those are resources that some writers have available.
Geoff, this is a question that I think was just fortuitously not asked that I think we can't not ask. How do you get an agent? People ask me this all the time, and I got an agent by accident. I got an agent because George Lakoff had an agent, and then I moved to New York and I met more agents. How did you get an agent?
Yeah, no, same way. I had an agent, actually George Borchardt, who was a very well-known literary agent, and didn't quite work out. And a friend of mine who was at Simon & Schuster said, "Why don't you use this guy?" And I called him, and we've been friends, and he's been my agent ever since. But
agents don't take things over the transom, though. You can't just send things to them.
I think some of them do. I think, particularly if it comes in. I mean, I know my agent Joe Spieler in New York. I've said, here's a guy. I mean, somebody will say, "Do you have an agent?" I say, "Well, here's a guy who's got a book idea, Joe. Do you want to talk to him?" And
that you can do, right?
Do that. Yeah.
In other words, somebody recommends you. Yeah, it
Right.
helps to know somebody who has an agent, essentially. That's a major part of getting your foot in the door, is getting an agent. And generally, you have to know somebody who has one, and that's not the hardest thing in the world.
Right.
Yeah.
Don't forget Patreon. Talk the Talk, we have a bunch of people who contribute to us a bit every month. We love our patrons. We do things for them. We put stuff out there. And they, in a very large way, support the show. And my next thing is trying to get a book out there so that all of my radio appearances are essentially ads for the book.
Definitely.
Also, look outside of linguistics for grants and things. The Pop Cultural Association has grants. I haven't gotten one, but I have applied for many. So outside of linguistics also wants to support public-facing work.
And NEH has the Public Scholar Fellowship. That's not exactly right, but it's close.
Well, folks, I think we have hit a graceful ending point. And I hope that we've answered all of our audience's questions, and then notice that we added one. And Daniel, Michelle, Geoff, and Anne, thank you so much for being here with me tonight. I think that we've learned from each other and hopefully taught the audience a thing or two. And so, David, I think we've come to our closing, and hopefully we can all see each other again sometime soon.
All right, many thanks indeed to all of the panelists for a really terrific discussion. And thanks to all of you in the audience for taking time out of your day to join us. We'll have a recording of this webinar available during the next day or so on the LSA's YouTube channel, and I will let you know when that becomes available. Thanks again, everybody, and have a good night. Bye-bye now.
Good night.
Thanks all. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you, David, and sorry for all this nonsense today, but we've learned.
We've learned very much. Thanks. Bye-bye now.